Well, I should say her playful defiance countered the intimidation tactics of the police and assuaged her fear that the anarchist experience was the beginning of a downward cycle, an ominous precedent that would soon be followed by other states. And she said the next victims will be socialists, single taxers, the Mormons, the prohibitionists, and any and all minority movements that may stand in the way of plutocracy and respectable vice. Arguing for a unified action, she asserted that piecemeal, the enemy can cut us into mincemeat, but working together, we are invincible. Now, many anarchists actually objected to Emma's emphasis on free speech, claiming that it was a natural right, not something the government had the authority to grant or deny, fearing that free speech rights would obscure the vicious battle between labor and capital, the violence on the street and in the factory. Envisaging a time when people themselves would be more directly responsible to each other, anarchists never placed their trust in the law as a fair arbiter of grievances. Goldman became a go-between between anarchists and liberals, a mediating force to translate the intentions of her comrades, to gather support for their often misunderstood efforts or acts, and affirm their rights without assuming public agreement with their actions or ideas. Especially after the assassination of President McKinley in 1901, an act that was attributed to a man who was said to have been influenced by Emma Goldman. At that time, fear fueled the passage of anti-anarchist laws, and national hysteria accentuated xenophobia and suspicion of foreigners. Emma Goldman was pivotal in the creation of a coalition of free speech advocates, most of whom, in challenging the law, found themselves defending ethnic, racial groups which they may never have had contact with before. And inadvertently, many anarchists who otherwise shunned the legal system would take their place among America's most fervent advocates of the First Amendment of the Constitution. If Emma was alive, she would probably have a supplement. During the most active years of her life, 1906 to 1917, using her magazine Mother Earth as a vehicle, Goldman crisscrossed the country every 6 months, reporting about her travels, always appreciating her friends in Colorado, along with mentioning her appreciation of the cool mountain air. The progressives that anarchism was, quote, the direct foe of violence, and a political philosophy predicated on the belief in the possibility of peace and harmony. To deflect the notion that violence was something foreign to the United States, she cited Thomas Jefferson and the tradition of deposing tyrants. Certain that intolerable conditions were the root cause of the use of force, she believed that anarchists, often caricatured as bomb throwers, impractical dreamers, or self-defeating activists vulnerable to the force of government, were in fact unsettling realists. She claimed that the first tendency of anarchism is to make good the dignity of the individual human being by freeing him or her from every kind of arbitrary restraint, economic, political, social. Goldman addressed a broad logic and never limited her political analysis to class conflict or to the inequality of the sexes, believing strongly that each individual ultimately also faces the challenge of freeing themselves from internalized tyrants. She was sure that no one would voluntarily choose to live in an unjust world, and assumed, quote, that every person endowed with a certain amount of sensitivity and independence must rebel against the meanness and narrowness surrounding them. Goldman's interest in the psychological impact of living in adversarial and divided conditions and to women's experience within it was especially evident in the series of lectures in which she linked the longing for love to the desire for community and a sense of belonging. In a sexually repressive era, Goldman was part of a vocal contingent that dared to speak about intimacy in a political context, raising issues in the 1890s and early 1900s that would become battle cries of feminists in the 60s, 1960s, 1970s, and continue to this day. Riding the waves of women's awakenings, Goldman distinguished herself from the bourgeois New Woman and the growing suffrage movement, whom she often caricatured as puritanical and humorless. Her goal was to do away with the absurd notion of the dualism of the sexes, or that man and women represent two antagonistic worlds. Women's freedom, to Goldman, would never be found within the bounds of marriage, nor achieved through enfranchisement. She said, true emancipation begins neither at the polls nor in the courts. It begins in a woman's soul. The organization outside the nuclear family was ahead of its time and really out of reach for ordinary people. Still, thousands crowded to her lecture halls, subscribed to her magazine, Mother Earth, and enjoyed reading about her clever interchanges with the police. With every lock that appeared on the door of a hall slated for an Emma Goldman talk, a free speech club formed to awaken the public to the necessity of preserving the right of free speech at any cost. Liberals and radicals, including those in Denver in 1914, joined forces to support Goldman's right to speak freely, even if they didn't agree with her, particularly about issues of sexuality, which is a familiar theme even now in music labeling, movies, web access, library books, curricula, inclusion, and more. Because of the fear of Emma Goldman and her notoriety and actually her large positive following, she was known far and wide, and it was not uncommon for her to receive her mail addressed to Emma Goldman, USA. Of course, this also meant that she was closely watched by those who believed that a persuasive anarchist was a threat to the nation. In 1915, before the U.S. entry into World War I, a torrent of reaction overtook the country. Emma Goldman warned the public about the impending war. In the face of this approaching disaster, it behooves men and women not yet overcome by war madness to raise their voice of protest, to call the attention of the people to the crime and outrage which are about to be perpetrated on them. The Supreme Court in Goldman's time did not assume responsibility for enforcing the First Amendment, leaving regulation of free speech to state and local governments. Local police, local courts responded as they pleased, leaving Goldman uncertain about when and how the authorities would suppress her thoughts, her talks. Despite and perhaps because of her defiant spirit, Goldman was more vulnerable to the abuses of power and was victimized as a woman, an anarchist, and a person living on the margins of respectability. She became a test case to see how much suppression of individual rights could be tolerated by the public as federal agents fueled repressive anti-radical and anti-immigrant hysteria surrounding the United States' entry into the First World War. Her sudden arrest in Cleveland and sustained jail sentence in 1916 for the same birth control lecture she had delivered for the last several years signaled the escalation of repression and foreshadowed her 1917 arrest for speaking out against involuntary drafting of young men into the military.